So, good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Peter Enrich. I'm Chair of Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts and am delighted to welcome you all to this month's PDM Forum. Um, for I'm sure many of you have a lot of awareness of the topic we're going to discuss today. For anyone who's been doing local politics in Massachusetts in recent years, the loss of robust local journalism has just been a huge challenge and problem. And it really is undermining the functioning of our democracy. So we are delighted to be able to spend today talking about some positive hopes here and the possibility of rebuilding a local journalism that actually serves our democratic needs. And we have a wonderful panel who I will introduce. Well, I'll introduce the moderator in a moment. I should start by saying that we've had to do a last minute change of plans because our intended moderator had an emergency, and so Julie Rafferty is not going to be able to join us today. Fortunately, we have a great cast of characters, and Ellen Clegg, who had already been signed on as one of the speakers, has agreed to step in and play the role of moderator as well. So I'll introduce her in one moment, but let me just say a couple of things beforehand. Our experience on these forums is that it is best if people don't use the chat to try and carry on side conversations about the topic. That tends to be distracting. If you have questions or if you have resources you want to make note in the chat, that would be very welcome. We'll be posting a bunch of resources in the chat as we go along as well. So with that, let me introduce Ellen Clegg, who is going to be a moderator and one of our speakers today. Ellen spent more than 3 decades at the Boston Globe in a variety of editorial positions. From 2014 to 2018, she directed the Globe's editorial page. She is now a co-founder of Brookline.News, which is one of the examples we're going to be focusing on today. And in addition, she, along with Dan Kennedy at Northeastern, are the co-authors of a book that talks about this whole set of issues in a very constructive way. Kathleen is holding up the cover of the book, What Works in Community News. So with that, let me turn this over to Ellen with our great thanks to her and the other panelists for joining us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Kathleen, for the invitation and for holding up the book. I'd like to introduce our panelists, 2 distinguished journalists, Sam Mintz and Barbara Rossner. Sam is the founding editor of Brookline.News. He has spent his career reporting on both local and national news, and we're lucky to have him since May of 2023. He's been the editorial leader of our nonprofit news outlet covering the town of Brookline. Sam grew up in Arlington and attended Brandeis University, class of 2015. Sam, is that correct?
Yes, 2015.
And he previously was a reporter at the Cape Cod Times back when it did have local news. And he spent 5 years in Washington, D.C., covering Congress and federal agencies for E&E News and for Politico. And that experience, I think, prepared him to cover Brookline Town Meeting. Barbara Rossner is founding editor of the New Bedford Light, a free nonprofit, all-digital news outlet that's dedicated to in-depth journalism and surfaces diverse community voices. Her newspaper career is epic. It spans 40 plus years as a political reporter, opinion columnist, writing coach, enterprise editor, and news executive. She's former executive editor and vice president of Hearst, Connecticut Media, and former managing editor of the Hartford Courant, where she helped lead the newsroom to 1 Pulitzer Prize and 3 Pulitzer finalists. She's a graduate of Wesleyan University, and she was a Knight Fellow at Stanford University. She now paints from her New Bedford art studio, which is just down the hall from the Lights newsroom. So welcome to Sam and Bobby. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to start by framing the issue. I'll do a short introduction and then ask questions to Sam and Barbara. So how did journalism how did it fall into this crisis? There's a local news crisis all over the country. Some 2,900 newspapers have shut down since 2005. That's some data from Medill School of Journalism in Chicago, compiled by a professor named Penny Abernathy. And she's been studying this for years. So 2,900 newspapers have shut down. That's a loss of 43,000 journalism jobs just since 2005. This comprises both dailies and weeklies. So we've gone from about 9,000 newspapers in the United States to 6,000. Why is this happening? There are 2 factors. It started with the collapse of the classified ad market, and classifieds, for those of you who may not remember, are those tiny little ads to sell pets, apartment wanted, pet wanted, jobs, that kind of thing. And when I was an editor at the Globe, I oversaw the Boston Sunday Globe. And in the early aughts, 1 page of classified advertising brought in $60,000. The Globe every Sunday ran 120 pages of classifieds. So that's significant revenue that supported our newsroom. Craigslist came along, made it searchable, made it free, made it digital, and the whole classified advertising market collapsed. There are only a few pages these days. And so newsrooms had to scramble to find new revenue from subscribers primarily to support the journalism. Now, newsrooms could have found their way out of this, I think, through innovation. But there's a second factor that exacerbated everything, and that's corporate greed. Corporate chains backed by secretive hedge funds bought up scores and scores of newspapers. Gannett Media is the largest publisher in the United States. It has over 200 newspapers, and it has acquired millions and millions of dollars in debt through this buying spree. So to pay down that debt and satisfy their shareholders, they've shut down papers to save money. They've laid off journalists. They've sold the real estate. They've created what Penny Abernathy calls ghost newspapers across the country, which have 1 or 2 reporters. So why does this matter to democracy? When James Madison wrote the First Amendment, he didn't envision a monolithic press. He envisioned many small newspapers in many small towns holding power to account. Kathleen's going to drop some studies in the chat that are good resources. There are a lot of political scientists studying the link between local news and democracy. They've found that newspapers play a role in voter turnout in hyperlocal elections, where voters may not have a lot of information, and you know, when there's no newspaper, there is a significant drop in down ballot voting. Municipal borrowing costs have gone up in counties where a newspaper closed. One anecdote, there's a study by 3 economists at St. Olaf College in Minnesota, found that in the tiny town of Bell, California, near Los Angeles, the town manager managed to ratchet up his salary from $72,000 a year to $700,000 a year, all with no press coverage. The LA Times newsroom, while still large, isn't large enough to cover all the localities around it. There's also some evidence that local news helps tamp down hyperpartisan fires. Why? Because that local news, we live our lives locally. This is where we shop, where we work sometimes, where we educate our kids, where we worry about whether the snow is shoveled, that kind of things. That shores up local identity. And local identity is part and parcel of politics. It's super important in an era where news has been nationalized by hyperpartisan cable stations and by social media. Social media, by the way, is not edited. It's libel proof, pretty much, thanks to an act of Congress in 1996 that exempts screeds on Facebook or Twitter or X from editing, from libel. And that was done in part because the internet was young. They wanted to prop up these emerging companies. Content in newspapers is fact-based, or should be, and it is edited. So with that framing, I want to start with a question to Sam. Why journalism? You graduated from Brandeis in 2015 when this field was already in a crisis and already very challenging. Why did you choose this profession?
I'm one of those strange people who's always known that they wanted to do something, and for me it was an extra strange thing because it was journalism. And the story I always tell is that when I was in, I think, 5th grade, we had a character day, biography day, where we had to dress up as a historical figure, and there was a lot of George Washingtons or Martin Luther Kings, etc. And I went as Carl Bernstein, who was one of the Washington Post Watergate reporters. And of course, nobody knew who the heck that was, and I had to explain the whole thing. But that's how somehow it got stuck in my head as a kid that this is what I wanted to do, and it just kind of stuck. And nothing, nothing that I've experienced has dissuaded me so far. I mean, I think like anyone who works in our field, I've had low moments and been tempted by jobs that were in policy or legal areas, things like that. But it feels like some of the most important work you can do. I love the independence of it, that, you're writing in your own name, which you really can't say for a lot of other writing jobs in the world. And I like the sort of being a truth teller and getting information to people. So it's always felt right to me.
Bobby, can you talk a little about your experience as founding editor of New Bedford Light? And how did you go about figuring out what your audience wanted? Has your approach changed over time?
So just a side thing, I'm so glad to hear Sam mention Carl Bernstein, because he's the reason Woodward and Bernstein, that's the reason I got into journalism, but it was in the 1970s. And I came out of college with quite radical political beliefs, came out of the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement, women's liberation movement, and all that. But I majored in classical languages. But anyway, I saw the power of investigative journalism to bring down a corrupt president. And I was really motivated to get into public service journalism that could be a potent force for good in a community and a check on power. I guess that's the fundamental thing to me. a check on government power, a check on corporate power, just get some power into the hands of the folks, you know? That's what democracy is all about, and that's what journalism is all about for me. So I had a long career. It had many ups and downs, great ups, but a long downward slide. I had to be in charge of newspapers that were taken over by corporate entities and stripped of resources and content and all that kind of stuff. And I moved here in 2015 from the New York metro area to retire, to chill out, to you know, come back into the land of the living, out of the land of the newsroom. And I was doing that for about a year, and then I came across a group of citizens in New Bedford where I was volunteering in a really interesting school. And these folks had gotten together maybe toward the end of 2020, really concerned about polarization. And through much roundtable discussion among them, they realized that so much of it was tied to the decline of the local paper. And that would be a Gannett paper, a daily paper, the Standard Times in New Bedford. It still exists in a ghostly form. So eventually moths to the flame, went right back into 24/7 journalism without pay. So anyway, because I know what good, strong, independent journalism can do. So the first thing that that we did was really develop a very strategic approach to our content. So I believe strongly that we need to look forward, not back. We're not about resurrecting the newspapers of yore, which weren't so great in some ways, especially the local ones, but really looking at the digital landscape, the information landscape, and figuring out what a community needs and what's missing. And so we looked very carefully at the information ecosystem, and we could see that the glaring gap, because the Standard Times does still cover police blotter and high school sports, which is important. The glaring gap was in-depth journalism, what we call enterprise journalism. And that's investigative, explanatory, really going deep into issues with complexity and, you know, capturing complexity and nuance and context and really tough issues in New Bedford, which is a very tough city. Half of the city, it's about 100,000 total population. Half are on food stamps. There are huge issues, all really related to poverty. And we could see that there's just a huge need to engage these difficult, complex issues with really, really strong investigative journalism. So we, before I get into what that looked like, we also saw that New Bedford is incredibly diverse, and it's up to us to try to portray the rich diversity of this city. And we decided that the best, most effective way to do that, and it's not easy, it's very challenging, was through the arts. New Bedford has a very thriving arts community. It's extremely diverse, it's multilingual, and just really a wonderful dimension of a city that has so many problems. So we came up with a content strategy that's investigate issues and celebrate culture. So we're different than other traditional news outlets, or to what, you know, I came up doing in the legacy print world. We're all digital, we're free. We go heavy on multimedia, we're heavy on social media. We have vibrant accounts across Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and all of that. We push our content out through really creative ways, and I can get into that at some point about our complex audience and how we reach them. So that's where we are. And we launched in June of 2021. And so we'll turn 3 this June, kind of hard to believe. And our budget is 1.6 million a year. We have 13 editorial employees and 5 on, I call it the business side, which means administration, development, and fundraising. And there's a firewall between the two because independence equals trust. That's how you build trust in a community. We have no ideological affiliation of any kind or partisan affiliation. We don't endorse candidates. We don't write our own editorials. We just play it straight, and we are not afraid of controversy or complexity, or complexity breeds controversy, and that's fine with us. We just go deeply into very difficult issues, and I can describe some of those when we get to that.
Thank you. Sam, same question for you. How did you're about to turn 1, I think, with Brookline.News. What's your vision? What do you cover? What's your staff like? And who's the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think there are some things that we very much share with the New Bedford Light and Barbara's vision, and some places where we differ a little bit. So, I and I think you, Ellen, as my boss on our board, see Brookline.News and the nonprofit journalism movement in general as a fantastic opportunity to sort of rethink the way that you do a newspaper. And so we've made a lot of decisions that have veered away from traditional local newspapers like the one that used to be in Brookline. The police blotter is a great example of something we talk about a lot. Our coverage of public safety. We don't do a police blotter because it's unfiltered and unfact-checked stuff coming from the police. That's something that we take seriously. So we get a lot of requests for that kind of thing from readers, but we explain that it's just not sort of part of what we're doing. So that's, in that way, I think we are absolutely looking at new ways to think about the best way to deliver information. At the same time, unlike in New Bedford, where, the Gannett newspaper, whose name I forget, does still exist and is to some degree still putting out news, although it's hugely weakened, like every Gannett newspaper in the country. In Brookline, there is no other local news site doing anything. I mean, there's the Brookline Patch that does really extremely minimal. They republish press releases and they write an article maybe once every couple of months that adds something to the conversation. But besides that, there is no newspaper solely focused on Brookline besides us. So I actually feel like it's pretty important for us to do some of the basics that local newspapers used to do and that the New Bedford Light often skips, things like meeting by meeting coverage of the town select board, where the town's making these really often important decisions about what it stands for, about how money is spent, about how taxes are allocated, things like that. And people just can't get that information anywhere else unless they're following the meetings themselves, which I think there is very little appetite for among even people who want to know what's going on. So and that, I think that's also an element of our size. We are a newsroom of 1 compared to the Light's newsroom of 13. I can't tell you how jealous I am of that size. And obviously New Bedford's a much bigger place than Brookline, so in a way it's more proportionate. But that also limits our ability a little bit too. And we're looking at ways to get creative with how we can use our limited resources to go more in depth and cover a wider range of topics. And I think as we're growing, which we hope to be doing soon, that's what we'll be looking to do, is to expand sort of the depth and breadth of the subjects we cover. And yeah, other than that, it's we care about variety a lot. Our readers do too. I'm very focused on government policy accountability. I covered Congress and federal agencies for 5 years, so that's sort of my wheelhouse. But our readers have been very clear that they want a much wider variety of coverage. They want business, arts, culture, events, people, features, profiles. So we work hard so that every week we have a variety of stories, and that's really challenging with again a newsroom of 1 and a roster of freelancers, but we're doing our best.
If I could just follow up on one interesting point I think is being made here, is that these new news outlets, startups, have an opportunity and responsibility to be unique to their communities
Mhm.
and unique to the needs of their communities. So if the Standard Times, which is the daily paper, were to fold, we would have to readjust our content. So that's really important to grasp that there is no formula. There isn't a formula. You got to create it anew. You got to go forward and not look at what was lost and let's bring it back. And no, look at what is unique to the unique needs of your community. And that's what was lost. That's what's been lost, is
And-
that unique content.
Right. And can you talk a little, Barbara, about what's your some of your favorite stories that you've covered? And can you describe maybe the investigative process for people who may not be familiar?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So as I said, we investigate issues, we celebrate culture. One of the great things we were able to do when we started, and we did start with one part-time reporter. I don't think we had a full-time reporter for maybe another 5 or 6 months into our launch. But we were able to pitch a story to ProPublica, which is a national investigative news outlet, probably the biggest and best in the country, to look into the who owns the fishing industry. So New Bedford is home to the most lucrative fishing port in the country. And, some of us were new to New Bedford and asking a question that seemed so obvious. And this is true of most of how investigations start. Why is the port so rich and the people are so poor? What what's going on here? And we really dug into it. It took us 10 months. It was brutally hard work, as investigative work is. It's slow, it's hard, it's expensive. But what we discovered through, and I won't take you through, the torturous reporting process, is that the Port of New Bedford has been taken over by foreign private equity, and in particular, a Dutch banking family, one of the richest families in the Netherlands. This was a shock. This was a shock to people. It was a shock to the industry. It was a shocking finding to everybody. And then we really documented what private equity has done to the people, the small fishermen, the independent fishermen, or the fishermen who work for them, and documented, as in so many other industries, including the journalism industry, how wages have been squeezed, working conditions have deteriorated, all that. And we were able to publish this very sprawling investigation that put us on the map locally, regionally, statewide, nationally, internationally. And that was a real risk on our part, because our day-to-day coverage wasn't as strong as it should have been. But one thing I learned in the business way back when is you got to go for the blockbuster. You got to go for something big. You got to make a difference. You got to show people what journalism can do. And that's, I believe, why we've been so successful in raising money. It's the content, it's the journalism, it's the quality of the journalism, and people respond to it. And we didn't even know if people in New Bedford and the area would, but they have. On the other end of kind of the investigative spectrum, there was a point not too long ago where the bus company discontinued the only route from New Bedford to Boston, discontinued it.
Wow.
But in the waning days of that route, we rode the bus with a video camera, with a reporter, photographer. We interviewed people. There were blind people on that bus. There were people whose health depended on getting to Boston for cancer treatment. There were people, this was the only way that they could get to work in Boston. And we ran that story, and guess what? The route, which by that time the story had been canceled, was reinstated. That's what local journalism can do. And that may seem but like a small thing. It's profound. So those are examples of the kind of investigative the spectrum of investigative work that we do, and constantly leavening and broadening this heavy stuff with arts and culture. And if you look at our site today, there's just a great lead story. It's not a story, it's a photo shoot of something we call street style. New York Times recently started street style column. Well, we started a couple of years ago. A local photographer that I met, he's also a DJ, he was spinning tunes at some bar, and we got to talking, and we started something called Street Style, and he does photo shoots on the streets of New Bedford. And it's just so cool to see how people are expressing themselves through their presentation of themselves to the world, right? And the diversity that we've been able to capture, unbelievable. And just so cool. And they're beautiful portraits. And to me, it was just radical to put fashion in New Bedford in the same breath. And so we've been very creative about the way we cover the arts. We also have something we call the New Bedford Fine Art Club, which is modeled after something that started in Detroit about 12 years ago. One of the local artists is from Detroit and came to me and said, they do this really cool thing where they just have an event, an open house at a diner or bar or wherever, and artists can just bring in their work and show it to potential collectors and buyers. So we've started doing that in New Bedford. And it is, again, if you're talking about diverse voices, it is amazing. And these local artists, anybody can participate. We've sold, I don't know, maybe $7,000 worth of local art with no commission. And they're live events where people, it's like the Moth, but through art. They show their work and then they pour out their life story. So that's one of the things that we do. Just another, quickly, the kind of anthropology of the culture, little tiny things like classifieds. And by the way, I'm still a classified reader if I can get my hands on a print paper. There's a fish auction in the New Bedford port every day. It's the largest fish auction in the country, and we update every day the fish prices. We call it the Daily Catch, and it has a devoted following. So
there's a question in the chat. How is the Light funded?
So we are nonprofit. We are funded by donations from our readers, from philanthropists who see the kind of work we're doing and understand the importance and the power of this kind of journalism. And we have a couple of founding contributors. Irwin Jacobs, who is a billionaire founder of Qualcomm, graduated from New Bedford High School and is a local philanthropist. He lives in San Diego, and we brought him in, and he has contributed quite a bit of money to us. And then we have 1,000 small donors who may give us $5 a month or $10 a year. And then we've been able to, and it's not easy, to get foundations, national foundations and local foundations to grant us money for specific projects. We just got a full-time climate reporter through Report for America. So we do a lot of constant talking to community groups, talking to larger groups, going to industry conventions and conferences to make our pitch, tell people about what we're doing. And we've been able to get funding, some from the Knight Foundation. We've partnered on big projects with the Marshall Project, ProPublica, as I said. And that's not to say that we can rest on our accomplishments in the fundraising department. It's a everyday round the clock, effort with marketing and events and, constant communications, stewardship, a word I never knew about. Uh, stewardship, no, I don't
Yeah,
do
me
that.
too.
Funny. And in fact, what I do is I just pitch the journalism. And then we have a great CEO, Leanne Camara, who has run many nonprofits around the country and is very committed to New Bedford. She's Portuguese born. And she just, we've got a team that works around the clock to get people to donate. And we do not accept advertising. There's no traditional advertising on our site because that really changes the nature of your content. Advertisers want clicks, they want traffic. And then you
That's-
have to
yeah,
satisfy
that's
that.
great.
And our measure of success is not our clicks, it's impact. So we constantly pitch to donors. Here are the stories of the last month, the last week, the last 6 months, the last year. Here are the stories that had a profound impact on our community. And that's how we get them to invest in what we do.
That, and Sam, I want to ask you a similar question, but about impact and your use of the Massachusetts Open Records Law to open up a secret listserv where town meeting members talk to each other and how that went. But I want to mention, Bobby, I think you have used a primer. Maybe is it from the Institute for Nonprofit News? There's a lot of resources online for people who want to start their own.
Yeah, when I first got involved with the group of citizens who were bemoaning the demise of the Standard Times and we need to start a newspaper, and I was like, well, you're not the first ones. We are in the forefront, but there's a way to do this, and there's a playbook, and it's online, and it's on the INN, Institute for Nonprofit News website, and became my Bible, from soup to nuts. How to form your board, how do you communicate with your community, how do you get a website, where do you go, all this stuff. So it's there's a playbook, and it's been around for a while, but I think it's quite relevant and operative now.
Great. Sam, can you talk a little bit about your favorite story or talk about your use of the open records law specifically to open up this secret listserv? That was fun, right?
Yeah, that was an interesting one. Yeah, so Brookline has a town meeting form of government, which means that there are around 255 elected town meeting members who each represent precincts across town, sort of the legislative branch of the town government. And there was an email listserv that they, for years, had all been using to communicate with each other, really doing it in whatever way you would describe as official business as elected, public officials. But it wasn't available to the public. It had been, there had been a number of political fights over that. Other people had requested it, and it sort of had never been made public. And so we just decided to dive in. It was something that our board had known about and been interested in and curious about, before I even came on the job. And so, at their suggestion, I looked into it, and, we used the public records law. We negotiated with the town, and so now they're sending us, all the emails that are sent on this server every week, and we sort of repackage them and publish them on our site. And the thing that's been really gratifying is that, it's the contents of the emails are pretty wonky often. They're, town meeting members talking about their specific pet peeves. I see Kathleen smiling. She's probably very familiar with all this in Brookline. But they're town meeting members talking about their various pet issues. Often it's a specific sidewalk in town or a tree that got cut down or that kind of thing. And so I worried a little bit that it would be too policy heavy, too in the weeds for our readers. But in fact, I hear from readers all the time that they love getting the emails and they love getting the insight as to what their elected officials are talking about and doing with their time and in their official capacity. And in fact, sometimes I'm late a couple days to post them just because it's not my priority to get these emails on our website. And I hear from people that say, "Hey, where are last week's emails? You know, I'm trying to keep up here." So that's been great. And it was, it was a battle. It was we had to go back and forth with the town. We had to bring in a lawyer to sort of help us sort out what we could get legally and what our rights were under public records law. So I think it was just an example of, sunlight is the best disinfectant, I think is the phrase that Louis Brandeis.
Right.
And I think, we one of the things that we fight for a lot is transparency and accessibility and accountability. And it's something that Brookline's town government has not been very good at in the past.
And, Sam and Barbara, I wanted to talk a little about the value of local news and in a hyper-partisan era. It's when Dan Kennedy and I were reporting out the book, we interviewed an academic, a political scientist named Joshua Dar. He's now at Syracuse University. And Kathleen dropped a link to his research paper, which is surprisingly non-wonky. It's free. There's no paywall to this one. And he partnered with an editor of it was a Gannett paper in California called The Desert Sun. It's in Palm Springs. And this was 2019. Trump was in full white there. And they decided to do an experiment. They took the editorial and op-ed page for everybody who probably familiar. Editorials are unsigned opinions that represent the institution. Op-eds are signed guest essays. And they decided to suspend national op-ed guest essays for 1 month. They to revert to do all local opinion, local editorials, local op-ed by local people. Topics range from zoning to sidewalk repair to climate change impact, which is pretty serious in California. And Josh then did a field survey before this started and then after the 30-day experiment, and found a slight signal of that hyperpartisan rancor was a little less. And he measured something called social polarization, which is a new thread of research among political scientists. And this isn't necessarily about policy. It's really a kind of tribalism. One of the questions Josh asked is, would you let your daughter marry a Trump supporter? That measures social polarization, not anything to do with policy. And he found that when people read stories that have to do with their community, fishing in New Bedford, or when they see Sam on the street, or in a 4-hour school committee meeting, it humanizes journalism. It reminds you, of that community connection. You trust it more. And it's an interesting study. Josh is promising to do more, and he's very active on Google Scholar, on X. I recommend his work. Any other questions?
Just to add up to the independence, the political independence has been a huge issue for us, because the group of folks, citizens who initially got together to think about a news outlet were progressives. And New Bedford is a conservative city. And Trump got over 40% of the vote in 2016 and more in 2020. And we have really, really had to hammer the notion that we are scrupulously independent of partisan politics. I'm not affiliated with a party, haven't been since I went to work at a newspaper in 1979. I've never had a lawn sign. I've never worn a button. I got a lot of them at home. Um, but it's really important. And there is a local AM radio station that is right wing. Howie Carr is on in the afternoon. And they have morning talk shows, and our reporters are on that station almost every day, taking call-ins from readers and talking, to the whole spectrum of political thinking. And I think that has been really critical in earning the trust of the community over time, and really important concept for all of us to embrace.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And Brookline is obviously politically very different. It's mostly Democrats, but it does have its political divides. A lot of times it manifests in sort of progressive versus classical or mainstream liberal. That's sort of the political fight in Brookline. And
Yeah.
it's felt very important to me to firmly establish that we're not on a side, that we aren't someplace, where people can go to sort of score points, use us to score points. And, we publish stories that make some people mad and other people's happy, and it goes both ways sometimes. But it feels pretty important to me as well to sort of establish that. And it's not. I would say it's not like it's not neutrality. I mean, it is. There's a sort of old-fashioned concept of objectivity and what that means for journalism, and whether it means sort of staying out of certain fights altogether. And that's not really what I'd say that we buy into. It's more about that we're being balanced and representing all sides of the community. And I think that's a bit of an evolution in how journalists have looked at this in recent years as well.
The other thing is to really convince people that we mean it when we say that there is a firewall around our newsroom, and that funders have no influence over our content. And we got to be way upfront about that when people donate $10,000 to us, or a bank as a funder, not an advertiser, gives us 50K, it's not to buy any kind of influence. And people don't even believe how pure we are. It's hard to convince them that purity is really there. And I know, Ellen, you know it too, and
Oh yeah. No,
yeah,
I
important
was
concept.
Yeah, the Globe has, and which is owned for many years by the New York Times, but the Globe and the Times are for-profit papers, obviously, but they have a strong firewall between advertisers and the newsroom. I live, my spouse is very active politically, and we have a rule, no yard sign. Well, we have no yard, but no signs in the window, no bumper stickers. I am an unenrolled voter, and the rules where you really can't be a joiner in a newsroom. So you can, I am a member of my temple, but that's it. And I wanted to reflect on nonprofits for people who are not aware, cannot write editorials, cannot endorse candidates, can't endorse ballot questions, probably can't editorialize on issues in general. That goes back to LBJ, who was angry that some Houston ministers were anti-Vietnam War and gave a sermon from the pulpit. So LBJ changed the IRS rules around nonprofits. Dan and I, in our book, we realized we profiled nonprofits and for-profits and One News Co-op, and there are actually more for-profit papers in the country, including startups. But they make money through advertising, through paywalls, through subscriber revenue. For a nonprofit allows a more diverse revenue stream of, you can sell sponsorships of a newsletter, you can sell advertising, it's just taxed differently, and you can also, you have a direct connection to the community. You have donors who give $5, you have donors who give $25,000, and you can seek community grants. So if you all want to, I want to sort of wrap up by saying, if you live in a community that's a news desert or has a ghost paper, and you want to start your own news outlet, how do you go about it? As Barbara said, the Institute for Nonprofit News is a great resource. Start by picking a business model. Are you for profit? Are you nonprofit? And then we in Brookline, we started with a listening Hillary Clinton style listening campaign. And we were on many, many Zooms with community groups. I sat at a table in Coolidge Corner in front of Brookline Booksmith and talked to passersby. We've had 7 house parties with neighbors and different parts of Brookline where we talked about what we were about and listened to story ideas. People donated. So there's, you want to incorporate with the state, adopt bylaws. You want to then perhaps get the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval if you're a nonprofit from INN. And you want to start raising money and figuring out what your community needs, as Barbara has said. And you also really want to professionalize. I believe in that journalists should be paid a living wage. The citizen journalism movement in the 90s, which was sort of pie in the sky, we all thought, well, the public's going to cover meetings and then write up a story for us. People have lives. That didn't really work out. And so gather funding. You can start with freelancers. One of the outlets we profiled in Memphis, MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism, the founder, Wendy C. Thomas, who was a hard-charging columnist for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, the legacy paper, she decided to start her own outlet focused on policy, poverty, and justice in Memphis. And she started with a $3,000 loan from an uncle and paid her freelancers on credit cards. She is an investigative journalist. She did a high-impact story a la the New Bedford Light. She investigated a nonprofit hospital that had predatory debt practices. ProPublica picked it up. She won the Selden Ring Award, which is like the Pulitzer, and grant money started flowing in. So every journey is different. But if anybody has questions, please reach out. See what else is in the chat. Are there any other questions?
You have given us so much to chew on that I think that questions may bubble up later on. But from my point of view, as a former newspaper person, as a journalist many years ago, this was extraordinarily interesting and rich. And I thank you, and I know Peter and the rest of PDM thanks you for giving us all this hope. Hope is what is so rare nowadays in public discourse, and along with civility. And I thank you all for doing this and for giving people a real roadmap for how this is done and all the different ways in which it can happen. So I join the rest of the audience, and I hope the people who'll be reading this or hearing this rather when we post it in a day or two online, because it was extraordinarily hopeful and helpful from my point of view. So I thank you.
I'm just going to jump in and thank you not only for these presentations, but for the leadership that all of you are providing in really finding a path into a troubling area and really offering some signs of how hopefully some of the others of us can rescue our communities. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.